So I'm continuing this series of conversations with Larry Diamond, one of the nation's foremost experts on liberal democracy, not just democracy, here at the Freeman Spogli Institute and the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Now, in the previous segment, we talked about the way that the Trump administration and DOGE were impounding funds and not allowing them to be spent. Those are being challenged in the courts as we speak. The problem is that it's going to be weeks and months until you get a judicial ruling on the legality of this. And in the meantime, a lot of organizations like USAID are dying because they've had to lay off workers. But people are not aware of the extent of this. And one of the targets has been an organization that we've both had long dealings with, the National Endowment for Democracy. So do you want to just bring people up to date? First of all, what is the NED and what has it been doing, and what's happened to it in the last couple of weeks?
Well, the National Endowment for Democracy was created by an act of Congress in 1984 to support freedom, civil society, movements for freedom and democracy and human rights around the world, and efforts to institutionalize, improve, and defend freedom and democracy in countries around the world.
And it was kicked off by Ronald Reagan.
Not in the United States. Yeah. Yes, and quite notably, it was created on the initiative of Ronald Reagan. And it was his famous speech, it's called the Westminster speech. Anyone who wants to can Google Ronald Reagan, the Westminster speech, to obviously the British Parliament in June of 1983, that launched the idea of the National Endowment for Democracy. And the endowment had also been floated, or something like it, as an idea by congressional Democrats as well. Most prominently, a longtime Florida congressman who at one time chaired the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Democrat Dante Fascell of Florida. And Reagan's vision was to have an organization that would not be a part of the government, but would be publicly funded, that would bring together people from across American society, business and labor, Republicans and Democrats, to devise programs and a system of grants to support people working to achieve and improve and institutionalize freedom and democracy around the world, and to resist tyranny, and hopefully one day maybe achieve democratic change in the Iron Curtain countries of Central and Eastern Europe. Someday, if one could imagine, in the Soviet Union, maybe someday in Cuba, in Iran, in China, in North Korea, in Vietnam, and so on. And in 1984, the endowment got going as an organization of 5 components: the umbrella organization, the National Endowment for Democracy, which makes grants to support civil society organizations, human rights groups, independent media, pro-democracy, civic education organizations in countries around the world, and in exile from the Soviet Union, the communist countries of Central and Eastern Europe, which have obviously since democratized, and then the 2 party institutes of the Republican Party, the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, Labor, the Center for International Private Enterprise, with its links to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and the Solidarity Center linked to the AFL-CIO. And for the subsequent 40 years plus, that's what it's been doing, is making grants and conducting programs and doing studies to support the advance of, and the idea of freedom in the world, and to give support to independent media, civil society organizations, civic education groups, and networks that are trying to resist the tyranny of the Ayatollahs and the Communist Chinese Party and so on, and defend and advance and improve and deepen democracy around the world. They do so, I might add, Frank, because you serve multiple terms on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy. They do so in two ways that I think should be very attractive to the Trump administration and to small government listeners around the U.S. Number one, their grants are pretty small by comparison with other organizations, including, say, the big contracts that the U.S. Agency for International Development might offer. And so they're, in a way, really pressing the grantees in these different countries to be very efficient, but not to be mired in suffocating bureaucracy. So there has to be accountability, there has to be reporting, but there's a lot of room for these organizations to use the grants in a very efficient way for their thematic purposes. And the second thing is that I think if you look around federally appropriated funding to achieve different things, it's a very lean organization. I think something like 83 cents of every dollar that goes to the National Endowment for Democracy goes directly to the grantees and programmatic actors. And there's a very thin layer of bureaucracy, enough to have accountability, enough to have compliance with federal government requirements, enough to really get to know the grantees, to monitor what they're doing. But the endowment itself, the party institutes are different. The endowment itself doesn't have offices abroad. The regional and country officers do a lot of traveling to engage grantees. It's a very lean operation.
Yeah, and so it's in trouble right now. So why don't you describe exactly what's been going on in the last couple of weeks?
Well, some elements of the Trump administration have quietly decided that the National Endowment for Democracy is something they don't like. They think it's partisan. It isn't. It's a very bipartisan and nonpartisan organization. There are two different party institutes, Republicans and Democrats. And if you look what they support ideologically, it's very broad. And a lot of it is work that I think many conservative Republicans and small government Republicans and people who are worried about the expansion of Chinese influence in the world would love. That exposes China's malign activities around the world, is supporting people who are trying to bring about change in governments that are America's most dedicated adversaries in China, in Cuba, in Iran, in North Korea, and so on. And nevertheless, they feel I think without quite a clear and comprehensive understanding that it's doing work they don't like, or maybe they think because its staff, have certain balance of party affiliations to the extent they can document them or infer them from their private activity. But there's no record that plays any role in the work of NED. And so what's happened is the funding flows through the State Department, and there is an office and an officer in the State Department who simply seem to have taken it upon themselves to stop the flow of appropriated funding. And that is a violation of the 1974 Impoundment Act. It is a violation, as you noted in our previous conversation, of what the Supreme Court ruled in 1974 on presidential impoundment of congressionally appropriated funding. But the practical fact of the matter is that if a piece of the government or a congressionally funded organization has its funding interrupted or strangled long enough, it simply goes out of business for lack of money.
They're expecting that the courts will take a lot of time to make a decision if they actually affirm that this is illegal to do, and by that time it's too late.
Well, this is very interesting, Frank, because the courts did rule on a temporary basis that the Trump administration's halt to the disbursement of funding for USAID was suspect, and that funding flow had to continue, but it hasn't continued. So now we have a kind of double jeopardy here, because on the one hand, the Trump administration with respect to USAID is withholding funding in what seems to be a violation of the rules and constitutional interpretation on presidential impoundment. And then secondly, federal court has ruled that this cessation is suspect and has put a halt to the halting, to the strangulation, and it continues. And they're just the mystery is that there's no open defiance, the money just isn't flowing. With the National Endowment for Democracy, as we sit here on February 18th, the situation could change in a week by the time this is aired. But at this moment, there's no lawsuit, there's no open contestation, there's just no money flowing.
A lot of staff have been told that they can't come to work.
Well, of course,
pay their salaries.
Yeah, and this is the objective. It's death by financial strangulation, with no accountability, no public ability to debate this in the halls of Congress, no legal authority, and no ability of the American people, who are probably barely aware of the existence of the National Endowment for Democracy, and who, I think, if they understood what the National Endowment for Democracy is and how much it expresses American values and aspirations in the world, and how cost efficient it is, and how much it is working in a I'd say almost a venture capitalist spirit, with very lean overhead and very much action-oriented and very much seeking high productivity rather than the waste, fraud, and abuse that the DOGE team says it wants to combat. The American people, if they understood, would love this organization a lot more than many pieces of the of what are formally the federal government. But there's no airing of this, no debate about this, and no regular process.
Larry, I think there's another issue that we have to confront directly. The National Endowment for Democracy has a certain definition of democracy that has been contested. And I think their definition is the one that we both believe in. We don't support, well, there are many definitions of democracy, but if you want to speak correctly, we support liberal democracy. And a liberal democracy is not just popular choice as expressed through free and fair elections. It is also the liberal part of liberal democracy are the rules underlying the rule of law, constitutional structures that limit the power of the government to interfere with the rights of citizens and so forth. And I think it's true that people at the NED, of course, they're very critical of Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, all these outright dictatorships. But there's also been criticism of other countries that have governments that have basically attacked the rule of law, that are democratically elected and therefore legitimate, but they're still okay. Well,
Sorry, I don't agree, but go ahead.
So that what comes under threat in the first instance is actually the rule of law and not democracy. Now, I suspect you're going to say, well, the elections weren't free and fair in any case, but it's certainly the case that the first target is actually the rule of law. And so that's why, there are many governments that have had, that have been elected, whether it's free or fair or not. This is Hungary, this is India, this is Turkey, this is Slovakia, where the real violation is actually to the rule of law, that those governments are not staying within the boundaries established by their constitutions, and that we regard that as a serious attack on, what is called democracy, but what we actually would label liberal democracy.
So I think there is a misconception, not only in the general public and certainly within some of the circles of American dialogue, public debate, and public life that are enthusiastic about Donald Trump, his presidency, and its initial actions, including some of these actions. There's a pretty broad misunderstanding about the boundaries between democracy and non-democracy and how the liberal element enters in. So it is...
And by the way, liberal meaning not in the American sense of liberal versus conservative, but in the more classical sense
Correct.
Of the rule of law, limitations on the
absolutely.
state action.
So we're talking about liberal not in the sense of left-right, not in the neoliberal economic sense of any kind of particular type of economic policy or program, but strictly in terms of a limited state, protection for individual rights, a rule of law, independent courts, the procedural elements of liberal democracy that generally result in a higher quality of democracy because rights and the rule of law are respected. Now, the proponents of what's happening now in terms of Trump's assault on USAID, NED, and many other institutions of the U.S. government, their argument is that what's happening in Hungary is just a different form of democracy. It's illiberal democracy, but in a way it's even more democratic because it's an authentic representation of the will of the Hungarian people. And the same in many other instances, Turkey, Hungary, so on. I think that we need to interrogate this and question this closely in each case, understanding that the irreducible dividing line between democracy and non-democracy is the ability of the people to choose and replace their leaders in free and fair elections. And you are right. I don't count these instances. India is a more ambiguous case now. Slovakia, I would say, still a democracy, but a very illiberal one, heading in a non-democratic context. But what this dialogue often misses is that Hungary ceased to be a democracy, an electoral democracy, a long time ago, because Orban so tilted the electoral playing field, so disempowered the ability of people to fund the opposition, the ability of independent media to give air to differing points of view, the ability of opposition parties to campaign and get the oxygen to have their views heard and known in terms of media and funding and campaigning and so on, that long ago elections in Hungary ceased to be free and fair. And of course in Turkey, the landscape is even more twisted and distorted by authoritarian practices of the desecration of the judiciary, which has long since ceased to be independent in Hungary as well, and the holding of political prisoners in Turkey, and so on and so forth. So there is a pathway of descent, Frank, from liberal democracy to an illiberal but still serious, authentic electoral democracy, but with less tolerance for dissent, more pressure on the media space and the courts, and less tolerance for difference, social differences, and so on. And then a descent from illiberal or lower quality democracy to illiberal non-democracy, or what Steve Levitsky and Lucan Way call in their book competitive authoritarianism. Hungary, Turkey, obviously Venezuela for a long time have been competitive authoritarian regimes. A country like India has been in motion for some time, from quasi-liberal democracy to illiberal democracy to a gray zone where reasonable people can debate whether the electoral system still has enough independence of administration, of the media, of campaign finance, and so on, to be called an electoral democracy. I think you can argue it either way. Mexico, the same. I'm not sure that we can really call Mexico now, with the ruling Morena party having a lockhold on virtually everything in the country, a genuine electoral democracy.
Okay. I think that that's something that we need to worry about in this country. Trump made this statement a couple days ago: if you're saving your country, judges don't have a right to interfere with that process. That would come as a great surprise to Justice Marshall, who, in Marbury versus Madison, established the principle of judicial review in this country, where judges actually can tell the other parts of the government that what they're doing is illegal and unconstitutional. So I'm afraid that process is really beginning here as well. And that's something we will have to monitor very closely.
My prediction, Frank, is that the Supreme Court is going to rule. This may sound optimistic, but it's my expectation that, there's obviously federal court cases being filed all over the place. Some of them the Supreme Court will probably decline to hear, and they may let lower federal court rulings against the Trump administration stand as they are, or some rulings that are favorable to the Trump administration stand as they are. But some cases they're going to take on, because I think they will see the fundamental importance to the future of the constitutional structure and character of American democracy. My guess is the debate about impoundment will be one of those cases.
Well, the 14th Amendment.
And birthright citizenship, the 14th Amendment. And I think in some of these instances, the court is going to rule against the Trump administration. And for that to happen, at least one justice, and I predict that if this happens, probably at least two justices that were appointed by Donald Trump will wind up ruling against him. But if there's a majority vote, however it's constructed, against some of what Trump is doing, then there'll be a test of whether Trump is going to repeat the famous authoritarian phrase, how many troops does the Pope have? Or in this case, the court. I think that then national pressure will congeal. This is maybe an optimistic statement because it will require some Republicans in Congress to take an explicit stand. National pressure will congeal to say, look, whatever our views privately on this policy or that, we can't have a president defying the federal judiciary and certainly not the Supreme Court. But we're in for some really sobering, testing moments for American democracy.
We are, I think, as we speak, we're already in a constitutional crisis.
Well, that was the argument of the essay I published recently in your journal.
And I would recommend that everybody read that. We'll put a link to the article that appeared in American Purpose, which is part of Persuasion, or the larger Persuasion family. I would also recommend everybody to subscribe to Larry Diamond's Diamond on Democracy new Substack, because there's going to be a lot more material along these lines. We are following these developments very closely, and we think that it's really important for the future of liberal democracy in the United States.
Thank you, Frank.
Thank you,
Always
Larry.
a pleasure to talk to you.
Same here.